समझ अपनी भाषा में ही आता है, कंटेंट आपकी भाषा में ओनली ऑन डेली हंट। हमें पता है आपको क्या चाहिए, अपनी पसंद का कंटेंट ओनली ऑन डेली हंट। रखो अपने एरिया की खबर, लोकल अपडेट्स ओनली ऑन डेली हंट।
Welcome back to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol. It's our great pleasure to present today Night of the Restless Spirits, Sarbpreet Singh in conversation with Rakshanda Jaleel. Night of the Restless Spirits is a fictional reconstruction of the horrors that followed the assassination of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi on 31st October 1984. Sikhs were targeted in the capital, New Delhi, and many parts of India. Writer, podcaster, and commentator Sarbpreet Singh reconstructs the brutalities of the riots and explores their far-reaching impact and consequences through the lens of fiction. Singh has also authored the best-selling The Camel Merchants of Philadelphia and is the writer and narrator of the celebrated Story of the Sikhs podcast. Historian, author, and translator Rakshanda Jaleel is a celebrated Indian writer, critic, and literary historian. She is the author of several acclaimed books, including But You Don't Look Like a Muslim. Together, they discuss the psychology of the mob, the trauma of those times, and speak of tragedy, truth-telling, and resilience. Sarbpreet Singh's most recent book is The Night of the Restless Spirits, a collection of short stories about the events of 1984. His podcast, Story of the Sikhs, has listeners in over 90 countries. Rakshanda Jaleel is a multi-award-winning translator, writer, literary historian, and has published over 25 books and written over 50 academic papers and essays. She runs an organization called Hindustani Awaaz, devoted to the popularization of Hindi-Urdu literature and culture. She was awarded the Kaifi Azmi Award for her contribution to Urdu, the First Jawad Memorial Prize for Urdu-Hindi Translation, and the Distinguished Translator Award by Vani Prakashan at the Jaipur Lit Festival. She also writes for every major newspaper, including the Hindustan Times, Indian Express, The Hindu, as well as magazines such as Outlook, Scroll, The Wire, and so on. She is the editor of the Taj magazine, a biannual book-length journal of the Taj Group of Hotels. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section below and asking questions, and we'll get Rakshanda to pose these of Sarbpreet at the end of the session. Ladies and gentlemen, Night of the Restless Spirit. Sarbpreet Singh in conversation with Rakshanda Jaleel.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. There are some books that you read that you cannot honestly say you enjoyed reading, because somehow enjoyed is not quite the right word. They move you, they haunt you, they trouble you, and this book is one of those books. Sarbpreet Singh ji, thank you very much for writing this. It's an important book. It's a timely book. There are stories here that I'd love to pick up and talk about in detail, but given the time that we have, we may not be able to do that. I will talk about the stories, I will talk about the concerns, but I want to start in a personal way. You know, there was a slogan that came out of the feminist movement: the personal is the political. I remember 31st October 1984, I was in my last year of college. I lived in Nizamuddin East, a neighborhood in Delhi, which was affected. Some houses were burnt, singled out, and there was arson in the neighborhood in Jaipur. I remember that day and the days that followed 31st October very clearly. I would ask you, where were you? What is your memory of that day?
So I was also in my last year of college. I was at Pilani at BITS. And I have to say that the events of Delhi 1984 largely bypassed me at that time. So Pilani is a backwaters, in Rajasthan. There were minor disturbances on campus, but by and large, nothing very significant. And it's also important to remember the media context in those days, several decades before the internet, where the amount of information that you had access to was very tightly rationed and controlled. So, of course, I knew that the Prime Minister, Mrs. Gandhi, had been assassinated by her Sikh bodyguards. I'd heard that there were some disturbances in Delhi and there might have been a riot. But that was pretty much it. And then, when I left Pilani subsequently, and I actually had to pass through Delhi, when I got to Delhi and talked to some of my relatives, I understood that something terrible had happened, but very few people were talking about it. And I really didn't have much of a sense of the magnitude and scale of what had occurred. My epiphany actually came several years later, after I went to the US to attend graduate school. And there, somewhat serendipitously, I started stumbling upon writings and reports, alternative views of what had happened in 1984. That, really shocked me because they were diametrically opposite to the narrative that I had read in mainstream media. So in a certain sense, I came to the horrors of 1984 somewhat indirectly, somewhat after the fact.
Right. There is a character in your story who remembers 31st October. He's a young boy, he's in school, and his school is called off, and a much awaited cricket match between India and Pakistan gets called off. So we have our own ways of remembering. And as you say, what we do with those memories are up to each of us, given our experience, our understanding of the world, and so on and so forth. I'll come to the stories later, but I want to still try and locate them in a context. One would have thought that in a country and a subcontinent as scarred by communal violence as we have been, the 47 violence and so on, one would have thought that we would have forsworn never to give in to this. And yet we have never been able to rid ourselves of communally induced, communally charged violence. Is there any simple answer to this?
Unfortunately, there is not. What we need to do is fairly simple, but the implementation is clearly tremendously difficult. And why do I say that? 1984 was not the first instance of sectarian bloodletting that we have seen on the subcontinent. And God knows that it's not the last. Godhra was 1984. There have been multiple instances.
Godhra was 2002. Yeah.
Right. So it was another 1984.
Yeah.
We had the makings of another 94 yet, which was perhaps preempted by the pandemic because the attention shifted elsewhere. But the events that we saw in Delhi, the attacks on the students, the violence that was perpetrated, in the name of faith again, it was tremendously disheartening. And I refuse to be cynical. I still believe that there is a common core of humanity, regardless of everything that happens, that still exists and is alive. And in a certain sense, I go back to my faith to deal with it. And the one thing that my faith teaches me is that, important as it is to articulate your pain, it's an order of magnitude more important to feel and articulate the pain of the other.
Yeah.
Now, if we started doing this, this might sound very naive coming from someone who has a gray beard like I do, but I believe that it's possible. I think that we have to consciously teach ourselves to embrace somebody else's pain. And if we can do that, that's probably the only way in which we'll be able to break out of this cycle, which, as you observe, is alive and well.
Yeah. So as you say, empathy, I also, for one, I'm a great believer in empathy. I keep trying to talk about how important it is to empathize. And that is one way of lessening the otherness and the othering that we seem to be doing, something that we ought to have stopped or at the very least reduced, given the suffering we experienced as a nation, as a people in 47, then I think the one lesson that ought to have emerged should have been empathy, and yet that's something we are very lacking in. In the first story in your collection, it's a very powerful story, Paji, and it ends with possibly offering us yet another solution, which seems to me forgiveness. Is that also the way out of this?
Yes, forgiveness is tremendously important. Forgiveness brings about healing, universally. However, it's important to note, and again, if I could digress for a second and go back to the ethos of my faith, forgiveness is tremendously important. If you'll humor a tiny digression, the sixth Sikh Guru, Guru Hargobind, one of his most beloved warriors was an Afghan whose name was Bande Khan. And, through an interesting set of circumstances, Bande Khan rebelled against the Guru and in fact led an army against him and was killed in battle. And the story goes, according to traditional accounts, that as Bande Khan lay dying, the Guru wept and forgave him. So the ethos of my faith really embraces forgiveness. But there's a small practical problem. The practical problem is that for the events of 1984 and several other events like that, there's nobody to forgive. And the reason why there's nobody to forgive is nobody has stood up and said, I'm sorry I did this. In a brilliant, the semantic chicanery is brilliant, that today, even those of us who are tremendously sympathetic, when we think about the events of 1984, the first word that pops into our head is riot.
Yeah. Sikh riot.
Yeah, the
and interestingly,
riot.
It is Sikh riot.
Indeed,
you put it on the victims, really.
Absolutely. So, the point is that if there was an acknowledgement of what had happened, if there was an acknowledgement that powerful state interests at that time had seen fit to perpetrate this horrible massacre, then perhaps we could move to forgiveness and healing. We're still at the stage where a lot of this violence remains unacknowledged, and attempts are made consistently through decades to explain it away in some manner. And unfortunately, that's the reality today. So I don't speak for the Sikh community, I speak for myself. I think that if somebody were to stand up and fess up to what had happened, take responsibility, and then ask for forgiveness, we could move forward. But that hasn't happened.
I think that's also part of a larger pattern. What you say is very interesting. My friend, the late philosopher Ramu Gandhi, used to say that just as we have a pind daan for the departed, we need to have a pind daan of all those people who lost their lives in 47, regardless of religion, regardless of ceremony and organized religion. But as you're saying, he used to say this for 47, that somebody needs to stand up and say, I'm sorry this happened. Now, the other side of forgiveness is revenge. And as you have written in story after story, there is the leitmotif that runs through what was happening in 84 is teach them a lesson. Revenge. They have taken one life, we'll take, and you refer to Khoon ka badla khoon and so on. How does one, in a civilized society, how does one grapple with the idea of revenge? Surely that's not the way forward.
It's not. And I think that the only thing that gives us maybe a little bit of hope is this very clear understanding that these brutal acts of violence and revenge are often not spontaneous. They are incited.
Yeah.
And if we really want to get to the root cause and solve the problem, we have to expose the ones who do the inciting, and we have to go after them and call them out every time. I mean, not to get mired in politics, but, when there was violence in Delhi, at the time of the Shaheen Bagh agitation, I think the world knew very clearly how the violence was incited and who incited the violence. I think we need to call it out. All of us need to call it out, regardless of who we are. And then, you have to cling to the hope that our fundamental humanity will kick in. And if we sensitize ourselves as a society to the fact that we are susceptible again and again to being enticed, maybe we can stop it. But that's what we need to focus on. Who does the inciting?
And the calling out need not be confined to the minorities. It's not, I mean, you and I, in different ways and different degrees, possibly have felt at first hand the othering. But the empathy will work only if it is felt by everybody within society. So I think also this business of, even on this panel, I'm not sure, but two members of two visible minorities speaking to each other, I think there needs to be more participation in this debate. What do you have to say to that?
No, you make a very valid point. I think the pain really has to be felt by everyone. That's absolutely true. And, again, the things that we have to watch out for, this is true of India, this is true of the US, given the past 4 years that we've endured. What we have to watch out for is demagoguery. And what we have to watch out for are political interests who are able, forget about the rabid supporters of demagogues. They always form a minority, and in my mind, they are beyond the pale. But in any society, there is always a group of what I call sort of the silent majority, the good people, who would be aghast if they were ever associated with some of the terrible things that we're talking about. And yet they end up being almost culpable, albeit unwittingly. Why? Because they fall for the seduction of demagoguery, which can couch hate in things that seem innocuous. I'll be very, very specific. I was last in India in early 2020, just before the pandemic, as the agitation was heating up. And I was speaking to a young relative who happens to be Hindu. He's a very bright young man in his early 30s. We had very cordial discussions. He was part of my extended family. He loved visiting gurdwaras. He visited the Sri Harmandir Sahib much more frequently than I have in my life, for sure. He had a real love for, my faith, which he shared in a certain sense, even though he was a practicing Hindu. But when we started talking about chauvinism, and I started talking about sort of this, the muscular identity politics that seem to have, fired the imagination of the majority in India, to my shock, this young man saw nothing wrong with it. He says, I'm not going to go and hurt anyone. I've never hurt anyone. I'm never going to hurt anyone. But, you have Muslim countries in the world. They're very proud of who they are. This is the only country where Hindus are in a majority. Why is it wrong for us to be proud of who we are? And my response was, you're absolutely right. There is no reason for you not to be proud of who you are. You should be. You should love your heritage. You should love your history. But you should recognize that when this muscular public chauvinism makes it difficult for me to breathe or for someone else to breathe, there's a problem. And that's the demagoguery that we have to be scared of, because it draws in well-meaning people who would never hurt a fly.
Right. Let's talk a little about the stories now. There are 8 stories. And what I like is that it's not just a monochromatic view. There's a range of scenarios. So you have how it impacts the administrative service, a young bureaucrat in a Mufassil town. You have the IPS. You have the diaspora, which is very important in a wonderful story. We'll come to that story separately. You have the army. You have the mutiny of one particular regiment, and the court martial of the people involved. Tell us how you chose these scenarios. Tell us a little about the stories, and please do read a short extract of your choice.
Certainly. So the stories were actually written over a large period. Roughly half of them were written almost 30 years ago when I was a young man, and half of them were written, a couple of years before publication, when I decided to do something with the stories that I had written. So the first few stories were very directly inspired by what I had read. Specifically, there are 3 or 4 things that I can point to. One of them was the so-called Black Book, the report published by the PUCL and PUDR that painstakingly documented what had actually happened in Delhi and who was culpable. And along similar lines, there was an article in Manushi written by Madhu Kishwarji titled Gangster Rule, which sort of completely coincided with everything that was in the report. The third thing that I read was an academic paper by Dr. Veena Das, who had been studying the children who had survived the violence of 1984. And, she talked about their PTSD and how they dealt with it. And then, of course, the early stories were also informed by some of the things that I was aware of that had happened to my relatives. One of the stories happens on the Tinsukia Mail. And I actually had relatives who were on the Tinsukia Mail that night, who saw terrible, terrible things, and they survived. So that's where some of the initial stories came from. The latter stories, I think, came from my readings and interactions with people, over the decades that followed. Because, as a public figure within my community in particular, I have been teaching young children for decades, and, I've been teaching them medieval history, and I've been teaching them modern history, and engaging with 1984 in a productive manner is something that I have really emphasized, taking the focus away from revenge and bringing it to understanding and empathy.
Yeah.
And that's why a lot of the latter stories, of course, have a subtext of, quote, terrible things happen to Sikhs, but also talk about terrible things that happened to non-Sikhs. They talk about heroic non-Sikhs who put their lives, their families, and their careers on the line to protect lives. And that's the important lesson that, I certainly try to impart to the young people that I deal with, that not everything is black and white. Just because 1984 happened, it doesn't mean that everybody who lived in Delhi, you can't throw everybody in the same garbage can, which, you can be prone to doing depending on your politics and, after the passage of time. So that's very important to me, to try and impart a sense of how the events of 1984 affected not just Sikhs, but others, and talk about some of their powerful and, I would say, heroic responses. Such
as the curfew, for instance.
The curfew, yes. Also Paji, the first story about the young student, whose entire family, puts themselves at risk trying to save the Sikh family in Mangolpur, or on the outskirts of Mangolpuri.
Yes. Can we talk a little about something that is problematic before we come to your reading, which is, the betrayal from within of the movement? You have a beautiful story, which is a a love story which is kind of woven with the diaspora, the Sikh communities, the wealthy, well-to-do Sikh communities in the US and Canada and so on, and the movement that arose there, and also the beguilement of young people, the entrapment occasionally, and the betrayals. Would you like to talk a little about that?
Yes, absolutely. So I was not in the US at that time. In 1984, I was still in college. I came to the US in 1987. But remember, just 3 years had passed. So the pain and the anger within the Sikh community, particularly among the young Sikhs, was still very, very fresh. And I had the opportunity to see that firsthand. So some of the characters in that story, the young doctor who gets quote unquote radicalized, I interacted with people like those and I understood their anger. What people did not know at that time was that the whole issue of the quote unquote Sikh independence movement, the Khalistan movement, the so-called movement had been heavily co-opted by sort of the dirty tricks brigade within Indian intelligence. And these things are just starting to come out now.
Yeah.
There were rumors at that time that a lot of the inciting of Sikhs, and by the way, there's this well-known book called Soft Target written by Zuhair Kashmiri and Brian McAndrew that talked about, what was behind the bombing of the Air India plane. And some of the things that they claimed were absolutely shocking. And, just in the interest of time, just to summarize, what they essentially said was that there was a Indian intelligence dirty tricks department, which was at that time called the Third Agency, and I believe later on was known as RAW, that was actively involved in inciting Sikhs outside of India to essentially give the quote unquote Sikh insurgency a bad name, which, in hindsight, they did with spectacular success. So, the moment in that story, we're talking about the general, the rally in Madison Square Garden actually happened.
Yes.
And, there were militant Sikhs there who said horrible things. What we don't know even today, and this unraveling will happen, there are rumors, we don't know today, who were they? What were they motivated by? What was their agenda? So in a certain sense, there were figures like the general who had been sent to the US to entrap Sikhs. And by the way, this is not unique at all to the Indian government at that time. This has been happening in the US, where intelligence agencies routinely, in the past several years ago, this came out, would target young Muslim men, radicalize them, encourage them to some sort of violent action, and then, quote unquote, catch them just before they were about to do something. Indeed. So this is a practice that governments follow routinely. So we shouldn't be surprised. That story really brings together a lot of different things. It talks about the lack of understanding in the diaspora about what was really happening in the Punjab at that time. And honestly, it talks to an incredibly confusing period where to this day, we do not know with certainty who was doing what to whom.
Yeah.
And these things will be unraveled. And, I'm hopeful that some of talking about these things will encourage the unraveling to some extent.
Right. Perhaps we could ask you to read now an extract.
Sure. I will read from the title story, Night of the Restless Spirit, which is, even writers have favorite things from their own work. And this is really the second piece that I wrote a long time ago. The story is very small, but the canvas is large. And, I'll leave it at that. The readers would have to read the story on their own to understand what I mean by that. He lies with his face down in the dust, his white beard matted, the last few strands of hair sticky with blood. Flies buzz around the red blotches on his chest and belly. His once proud turban, now a shapeless rag dyed a new color. He can't feel the pain anymore, just a dull throbbing sensation and the sticky wetness. He wishes that his last thoughts could be different. He would like to say the Sodar once again, but he can't collect his thoughts. Each time he tries to mouth the first verse, his thoughts disintegrate into visions of violence and anger and discord. His frail old body gathers strength only to tremble in rage and lie still again. What is left of Hukam Singh lies by him, between him and the marble wall, richly adorned in red. Hukam Singh's hands are tied behind his back with his saffron case key. The last of the old school grand raggis. He lives and breathes rags and gurbani. His voice is old and cracked, and it trembles. But every note is crystal clear and touches the basest of hearts. Hukam Singh's last performance is over. And what a performance! His Jodidar, who accompanies him on the tabla, has fled. But the LMGs that the Jawans carry sound like a perfectly tuned tabla. How sweetly the guns sound the kehrwa, dinakatinakadin, dinakatinakadin. That fool of a Jodidar could never play the kehrwa right. He should have been here to listen to the soldiers. Hukam Singh's last performance is unusual. There is no Manglacharan and no Alap today. There is no time spent in tuning the tanpuras and the tabla. And instead of sitting down and whispering in undertones, the Sangat is uncharacteristically quiet and calm. And their heads are bare. Such disrespect. Their hands are folded, tightly folded, but oddly behind their backs. They look scared, so scared. The perfectly timed kehrwa begins on the guns, and in an unbecoming and ungainly display, the Sangat twitches and jerkily dances to the beat. And then Hukam Singh's voice joins in a joyous celebration of the rhythm. His voice soars to the sky in a wonderful new rag, rising and falling in ornate gamak-embellished tans, effortlessly spanning tens of octaves, expanding until the Gurdwara, then the village, and then the entire Punjab echoes the sound of the furious melody crafted so carefully by the widow and her gleeful kehrwa pounding divisions. It stops as suddenly as it begins. The last few notes bubble out of Hukam Singh's body and drip onto the old man's face. The Sangat has stopped its undignified, jerky dance and is sleeping, silent and sated. The widow's musicians have taken their music and left, searching for another audience. Baba Fateh Singh wipes the pool forming before his eyes, but there is still a haze before him, making him squint. He groans as he somehow manages to raise his head a few inches off the ground. Hukam Singh's lifeless face has a grimace frozen on it, as if he had died in the middle of a particularly intricate movement in the rag. So just for context, this story is actually set in the Dukh Nivaran Sahib, which is a Gurdwara in Patiala, which, along with 40 plus other Gurdwaras, was attacked in concert with the Golden Temple during Operation Blue Star, and an actual massacre did occur at Dukh Nivaran Sahib, which is the setting for the story.
Thank you for that reading. the audience is invited to send in their questions. I'll be able to see them in the box here. Should you have any questions towards the end of the session, but till those come up, I had a question of my own, Sarpreet ji. You know, this whole business of proving one's loyalty, which of course is there in the context of the 84 riots, but all the time, minorities are required to wear their patriotism, their nationalism on their sleeve and have it on display at all times.
Indeed.
And this is troubling and deeply problematic because it brings into question one's loyalty to the nation, which one would imagine is not something that you need to constantly prove, and it is hurtful, it is offensive, it leaves wounds and scars. You know, in one of your stories, The Court Martial, I'd like you to talk a little about that story. It is about the mutiny in the Sikh regiment, and after the Sepoy mutiny of 1857, you know, the first war of independence. This is something that's happened to the Indian Army again, and one doesn't know how to deal with it. And the story ends with this general saying that, you know, I had to redeem myself. So this stain that Sikh officers felt that they had to prove their loyalty. This must be a very heavy burden. Is this coming from news reports, or is it coming from something more specific?
Well, it comes from a very personal place. You know, I was never in the army and I was never put in the position that that army officer was. But I can tell you that as a young Sikh who had grown up outside of Punjab, I was raised in Sikkim, in Gangtok, where there was, you know, no Sikh community to speak of. And then subsequently, I was at Pilani and then in Bombay for a couple of years before going to the US. Now, in the years leading up to 1984, there was this pervasive narrative in Indian media that, you know, the Sikhs had started this insurgency. The Sikhs are a pampered lot. You know, they have thrived and flourished in India, and yet they are threatening to tear the nation apart. And as that narrative was put out, I can tell you that every Sikh felt culpable. Every Sikh felt that the collective finger of the nation was pointed at them. So much so that I can tell you that after the events of November 1984, following Mrs. Gandhi's assassination, a lot of sensible, kind, good people, nobody felt that what had happened to the Sikhs in Delhi was right or okay. They all agreed it was a tragedy. But so many had a sneaking suspicion that the Sikhs kind of asked for it.
Yeah.
Why do I say this? Well, that's how I felt. As a young Sikh man, I was so much under the burden of this narrative that's how I felt as well. Leaving India, leaving that, the relentless sort of hammering of that narrative
It
is
freed
what,
you.
yes, that's what allowed me to come to terms with what had actually happened.
Yeah.
And that's when I learned that it was okay to feel what I was feeling. So you're absolutely right. This has been a tremendous burden. And, you know, I know we are short of time, but very quickly, there has been no addressing of 1984, even within the Sikh community. In India, we are told to move on. And as
Yeah.
a small minority, percentage-wise at least, we feel that pressure. There is shame wrapped around our memories of 1984 because we, the proud protectors of the common people in the 18th century in particular, had been subjected to this terrible violence. Our homes were invaded, our daughters and our sisters were raped, and there was absolutely nothing that we could do. So there was PTSD, there was trauma, there was shame, there was pressure. So there has been certainly there's been no reckoning. So there has been no catharsis. And, you know, I mentioned this to you in a private conversation earlier. So the last piece in the book, A Story in Verse, Gultar's Mime, was turned into a play by my daughter, who was then a young college student. and we toured it extensively around the world. And we saw an outpouring, a spontaneous sort of outpouring of sorrow and catharsis. And we had Sikhs and non-Sikhs everywhere we went, whether it was Vancouver, whether it was Kuala Lumpur, whether it was Delhi or Amritsar, every audience had survivors. And people stood up and told their stories. And they talked about this burden.
Yeah.
So the burden was pervasive, and it prevented us from any sort of confrontation of what had happened for 30 plus years.
Yeah. So there is a question that's come in, and a very interesting one. If you could give a very brief answer, because we just have about 3 minutes left. Rukaiya asks, do you think one can or should be neutral in matters of a riot? Does that say something of that particular person?
So this is a very difficult question. It's easy for me to sit in my chair in my study in Boston and say that no, absolutely no. The answer is very clear. No, we should not stand by. We should not. We should engage. We should absolutely shout out, at the top of our voices that what is happening is wrong, and we should try to protect the people being attacked. Is it easy to do? No, it's not. But let me tell you, when Sikhs were being attacked in Delhi in 1984, when Muslims were being attacked in Delhi in 2020, there were people who stood up and they confronted the attackers. They told them it was wrong in certain cases. They shamed them and they made them stop. So the answer very unequivocally is, difficult as it is, we cannot stand by. And I'm mouthing a cliche here by saying that if we stand by as somebody is being attacked, who's going to come to our aid when we're the ones being attacked tomorrow? I mean, think of it even in those selfish terms. We have to do this as a society. We absolutely have to do this, because if we don't, then where's the hope?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarbpreet Singh ji, for this useful, important, timely discussion. Thank you also for writing this book. And we've come to the end of our time. I just want to end with a prayer for bloodied Punjab. Punjab that has been ravaged for centuries. There have been the Greeks, the Mongols, wave after wave of invaders eyeing Delhi, the Afghans, the Pathans, the British, what have you. Of course, it was a bloodied corridor in 1947 for people going to and fro. And it is the same Punjab that needs our collective prayers today. So let's end with that. Thank you very much. More power to your pen. Thank you.
Thank you, Rakshanda ji. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Sarbpreet Singh, Rakshanda Jaleel, for that incredibly bone-chilling conversation about what unfolded in October. I remember that was the day that Punita and I were to get engaged on that particularly fateful day, and the first tragedy that happened was outside at the corner, the crossing of Tughlaq Road and Prithvi Raja Road, where a mob got hold of a scooterist and placed a tire around their neck, and he was burned. The trauma of those times we continue to live through, and thank you for bringing it to our notice today. A great way to end today's program. We thank our celebration partners, Diageo. Thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Please remember to come back and log back on for the rest of the sessions, and of course, the evening music as well. All of this has been specially curated for you, and we bring them from Jaipur's Digi Palace. Remember, if you can help by donating, please do. Just contribute whatever you can to teamwork and our cause to ensure the free flow of knowledge and ideas. Stay safe, stay masked.